Okay, as Rick said, and I need to stress this because I'm always at the tail end of these problems. I'm the mortality management guy for the state. I work alongside Mark Hedrick at the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry. If you can depurate, that's really the best option, and we really always hope for that to happen. In my situation, the farm that I went on to just had numbers that were just too high. They had swine, dairy, and beef, and the animals were much older. And the chance of depuration, given they had very little clean feed on site, was pretty grim, to say the least. It was one of the highest as far as both PFAS compounds and a lot of the other surrogate compounds. And so the farmer who really loved their animals had very hard decisions to make. And so it took quite a bit of time, but finally the decision was made to euthanize the animals and try and recoup some losses. So we chose composting as a carcass management tool. Maine is a really strong proponent of composting. We have been since the late 80s. We have a Maine compost team. We started the Maine Compost School, and most of the members of the Maine Compost team and the retired members are also subject matter experts for the USDA. We travel around and help deal with mortalities in other states following diseases like avian influenza and things like that. So we wanted to basically compost these animals in a series. We started um, with the hogs, and I'll get to that in a second, but this just shows you some of the PFAS numbers. I mean, the fields were just exceedingly high, so the feed from it just wasn't going to be very helpful. Same with the meat, manure, and the milk. You can see the numbers were just really, really, really high. And so those numbers led the team to believe that depuration, even if we could import clean feed, just didn't make sense. And this just shows you some of the feed itself. I mean, it's just the numbers range from, a low of like 0.44 right up to super high 352 and 396 parts per billion. So just really crazy numbers. So this is the actual farm itself. I've tried to do my best to provide anonymity. I will tell you that in my past life as a compost or as a sledge regulator, back in my very early days, I actually wrote the license for this site to spread biosolids. So I have a lot of intimate familiarity with the site. And so basically this is the farm operation. This is where they currently had a compost area, and that's where we decided we would actually do the compost activity. So just to talk about composting for a second, some of the major benefits is it does tie up nutrients that would normally, if you bury an animal, they would go to groundwater and cause contamination. So it ties it up in a pretty recalcitrant compound. It reduces and treats leachate generation similar to the tying up nutrients. It reduces odor and possible vector attraction, which makes it a valuable product afterwards as far as final disposition of the material because it's less gross. Most places won't take a carcass that's bloated and putrescible and smelly, so it gives it a little bit better option. And it makes the materials less bulky and easier to handle. And we were hoping maybe a possible reduction of PFAS levels. That was how we went into this. Because I am a subject matter expert with USDA, myself and several others put together some livestock mortality composting protocols to get ready for potential problems in the future. And we use those protocols for our study at this Central Maine site. And what we did is we made a base bed about 18 inches thick of a mixture of shavings, which were PFAS free, and haylage, which was contaminated. And the carcass themselves, we also put a mixture of manure and haylage on top of them, but we also covered them with some manure to kind of tie them all together. And then finally, we did a cap of shavings and haylage 50-50, about 36 inches thick to allow insulation, odor control, to keep vectors out, and just to keep the pile cooking. So first animals, as I said, we started out with the swine. There were 35 adults. They were very old, and basically depuration once again was not possible. This just shows you some of the numbers. At the time, they had an action level of about 3.7 parts per billion, and the animals averaged about 8.4 parts per billion. So there was just no decision other than taking them to compost. So what we did is the farmer worked very closely with Mark Hedrick and I, my colleague from DACF, and we laid out a bed, which was a mixture, a 50-50 mixture of haylage and shavings. And there's Mark Hedrick there helping to spread the bed out. Once we got that bed made, the veterinarians came in the next day. They had a special system. They very carefully euthanized the animals with a sedative and then with a final blow medication and a captive bolt. The animals were brought down, and because hogs, even though they're about 300 to 500 pounds, are a little more easy to maneuver, we were able to drop them on the bed and then move them around to wherever we wanted them, which was really quite handy. This is the mixture of the manure and the shavings and a little bit of haylage that went over the animals. That's going to be the cover. But prior to that, we dumped some fresh manure that was very contaminated to tie them all together. There was a lot of voids in between the hogs. And what the manure did was it took those voids away and kind of made like one long connected item that could compost quickly. There's the final cover. The animals were checked. We put in thermometers, several locations. We put in 1 foot and 3 foot. The reason why we do that is the 1 foot layer is the hot aerobic outside layer of the pile. And the inner layer, the 3 foot layer, is the core where it's slowly composting. And what we do is we use those two temperatures to help us decide when to turn the pile. Whenever the difference between the 1 foot and the 3 foot exceeds 20 degrees Fahrenheit, that's an indication to turn the pile. But specifically, we wanted to try and get all the contents to reach 133 degrees Fahrenheit or 131 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 consecutive days. It did super well. In this case, we didn't turn the pile till the end because we wanted to make sure they really cooked well. So on day 32, it got a turn. You'll always see a drop in the pile temperature after the turn, but usually within 24 hours, it picks right back up again. And this is what was left after the 32-day period when we did the turn. I mean, all that soft tissue was pretty much gone. Even the brain cavity was pretty much empty. So then the next step, which was a little bit harder because these animals were quite beloved to the farm manager, but once again, depuration just wasn't a possibility, was the dairy cows. And they also had some pretty significant numbers. You can see that the average PFAS level was around 50 parts per billion. That's pretty much way above the standard beef that was around 3.7 standard. So once again, we made the beds, same setup as before. We put lots of cover material out because we knew we had to have extra beds available. And the animals were brought to the bed and they were put on with the skid steer. But the problem with these guys is that some of them weighed as much as 1,300 pounds. We can't just move them around. Even with 2 of us tugging on them, it just wasn't possible. So we actually brought in an excavator with the thumb. I took those slides from my presentation because they violated YouTube's policy. But what the thumb did was allowed you to grab it, pick it up, and place it exactly where you wanted to in the pile. And when you're doing these kind of activities, you want to get the animals on the piles as quickly as possible and covered for many, many reasons. But the most important is that the farmer was down there with us. And we just didn't want him to see this. We wanted him to just see the pile and know it was all being taken care of. So there's just a lot of humanity that you gotta put into this. But this is the material that was used to cover. And this is that excavator that we talked about with the thumb. And it picked him up and did well. This guy was awesome. Sad note, a week after this event, he was out fly fishing and dropped dead. And it was really horrible because he was going to be our go-to guy for future events. It just was really, really traumatic for them, traumatic for us because we had developed a kinship with him. So it was really quite unfortunate. So this right here is Mark and another fella from the department that are looking at the piles and just making sure everything's great before we place the thermometers. And once again, temperature profiles were really good. I will tell you that when you mix manure and shavings together, you make jet fuel. It's the best compost in the world. My favorite compost is actually horse manure and corn silage. That makes a super jet fuel as well. But super great temperatures. And once again, the animals were brought down to nothing but bone in a very short period of time. Now, this is a really important piece that I wanted people to understand, that these animals have a huge amount of water in their bodies. And so when you look at the amount of leachate that could have gone into groundwater, you figure the weight of the animal times the percent of water in their body, times the number of animals, and then divided by 8 pounds, which is a gallon of water, about 8 pounds. It tells you that just between those two alone, we had close to 8,000 gallons of leachate that never made it because we made these beds so thick they absorbed everything. And the other beautiful thing is that leachate is the moisture in the leachate holds the odor and it makes it stinky. When you take the moisture and absorb it into the carbon sources, it takes away the odor, it takes away the attractiveness. We never had a single problem with vectors on these sites because of the fact that they didn't smell because they were so well protected, which was really kind of a nice thing. So this just shows you at the end of this study, we basically just took samples of the finished compost for PFAS, and the numbers were pretty alarming. But the kind of the truth in this is that the manure that we put in had really high numbers, and the feed that we put in had really high numbers. So this really wasn't that bad a result, but it was bad enough that you couldn't land apply it. So right now it sits on site looking for a possible home. Now this is I have a good friend in the state. His name's Andrew Carpenter, and he went through and took a look at every factor involved in I believe, the hogs. And he found that if everything had gone perfect, I should have only gotten 59 parts per billion instead of the 97.5. So what that indicates is there possibly was some precursor transformation occurring during the composting that actually resulted in higher PFAS levels at the end. And I actually have found that again. We just recently did a study last summer where we took 13 of the remaining animals, the last animals they had on the farm, and they were put down. And we actually did a study that extended over 11 weeks. And every time we turned the pile, we took a sample for both PFAS and PFOA. And if you look carefully at this, over the course of the 11 weeks, the PFOA was a pretty steady increase, not significant. But if you look at that last bit on the PFAS, that October 1st through the middle of the month, you can see that there was a big jump. And we believe almost conclusively that was precursor transformation due to the oxidized environment and possibly the heat contribution as well. These piles did get up to about 160 max. So does it mean that composting is a solution? It doesn't get rid of PFAS, but what does it do for us? And the answer is that we believe that it takes a material that nobody wants and makes it into something that's more handleable. And my feeling is that material could be used on landfill as alternative daily cover in place of some of the other materials that they're using. And so that's kind of what I've been pushing. But other things that we're thinking about doing, we're doing some containerized composting. We're actually composting inside a 30-yard roll-off container. And we're kind of using a coarse wood chip base, and we're pointing the opening of that container towards the prevailing wind and letting natural convection or forced aeration through Mother Nature help to drive the process. And the idea is that when you're done composting, that roll-off can be taken away to an ultimate disposal operation. But I do definitely believe that it should be used somewhere beneficially because the nutrient reuse, it does avoid disposal. Another thought is the possibility of cropping with lower PFAS level compost to allow the fields to rejuvenate. That's another thing I'm looking into. But the daily cover, I think, is going to be the best seller at this stage of the game. And then this just shows you containerized composting. I did a study with some turkeys, and they composted super well. And once again, I used only horse manure, but it's bedded horse manure fresh from the racetrack. with lots and lots and lots of biological activity. And this stuff just the turkeys were gone in less than 2 weeks. So I believe that composting can be a tool to help us deal with PFAS contamination, but the final disposition of the material is yet to be determined. And that's really kind of where I want to leave things with that. And I will now pass it back to Glenn. Let me see here.